plugged in. Can you hear me? I'm not on. You know I'm not on. Hello? Am I on now? No? Now? Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Southern California Institute of Architecture. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening's program, but to start out with, I have a bit of a story to tell you about how it came about. Last October, I'm sure many of you were here, we had a visit from a delegation from the Soviet Union, which included Yuri Platonov, the president of the Union of Soviet Architects, and Alexander Kudryavtsev, who was the head of the Moscow Architectural Institute. This program was an exchange which was sponsored and organized by architects, designers, and planners for social responsibility. Shortly after their return to the Soviet Union, we learned through ADPSR that the school that they had chosen to do the first exchange with in the United States was SCI-Arc. Through numerous telegrams and midnight phone calls to the Soviet Union in Russian, we did manage to make arrangements for the exchange to take place, and leaving next Thursday are 5 students and an instructor from SCI-Arc who will spend 5 weeks in Moscow in a studio with the same number of Soviet students, and then they will all be returning to Santa Monica to complete the studio for an additional 5 weeks. So I'm sure that all of you will be hearing Russian spoken around the school. There is one person here that I haven't mentioned who's also joining the delegation. I know that most students and faculty and the staff here at SCI-Arc think of Rosemary Rabin as the one person that in a bind, when everything else has failed, that they can turn to because she can always solve your problems. Matter of fact, she does this for about 400 people every single week, which is why all of us who really know that she's the person who runs this school and have no doubts about that. I think what a lot of you don't know is that a few years ago, she and Ray Cappy started the very first chapter of Architects, Designers, and Planners for Social Responsibility here in Los Angeles, and it has now grown to a national organization of which Rosemary is the national vice president. Rosemary has put together this studio with the Soviets, and when we celebrated, and I know she's out there, so forgive me when I reveal this fact, when we celebrated her 65th birthday in June, and those of you who are wondering, don't panic, she's agreed not to retire. We wouldn't let her. There seemed to be only one gift which was appropriate to give her at that time, and she will be leading our delegation with Michael to the Soviet Union and leaving on Thursday. And that gift is from SCI-Arc to Rosemary for everything which he has done through ADPSR and here in SCI-Arc. At any rate, back to my story. So we're sitting here, we're going, well, what are we going to do with the students and how are we going to set this studio up? And so Michael mentioned to me one day, he goes, gosh, wouldn't it be terrific if we could get Catherine Cooke here? So lo and behold, I had no way of reaching her, so I just sent off this letter with our proposal to care of AD in London. And about 2 weeks later, I received this letter from her, which was absolutely incredible, in which she said that out of all the exchange programs that she had worked on, none of them was as collaborative as ours, that it actually used a design studio and not just a touring exchange of the countries. And I was so excited when I got this letter, and Ruth goes, oh, you got this letter from London. I'm going, oh, wow. And so I tried to reach Michael. Of course, he was out, as we all know. And I was so excited, I went, as per usual, I won't bother waiting for Michael, and I immediately got on the phone and called Catherine and said, you must come, you must come. And I'm sure at this point she's sitting in her home in Cambridge and going, crazy Californians, this enthusiastic person jumping up and down on the telephone. But indeed, she did agree to come. She's been here this week. I know that all the students involved have been extremely excited about her visit. and she really deserves to have a very formal introduction. And so at this point, I'd like to turn this over to Margaret Crawford, who is the head of our history theory department.
Well, I'll keep this very brief because I'm sure that everyone wants to hear the lecture. But I just want to mention how personally pleased I was to come back and to find out that Catherine Cooke would be coming to prepare the students for this Soviet trip. Because 10 years ago, when I was a student, I heard about, in England, I heard about this wonderful woman who was teaching about Russian constructivism at Cambridge. And I made the trip weekly to Cambridge to hear her lectures. And it was really an outstanding experience. And I knew that I was in the presence of something that was extremely unusual. And so I'm very happy that these students are going to have the same experience and realize that this experience is a very unusual one because the very complex and sometimes arcane subject matter of Russian constructivism is perhaps one of the more abused areas of scholarship. And so we're extremely lucky to have Catherine Cooke, who is probably one of the few scholars who has a deep familiarity with the Russian language, Russia, the Soviet Union itself, and the materials of this period from very first-hand experience. And so I just want to tell you a few things about her experience, aside from the vast amount of scholarship that she has been doing on the Soviet Union. She has been teaching also. She taught at Cambridge, both in the design studio, and I think I should mention, she was trained as an architect in the architecture faculty at Cambridge. She then took her PhD there at Cambridge with Lionel March, who some of you may know is the program head of the architecture program now at UCLA, right here in Los Angeles. She's taught design studio and history courses at Cambridge. She's lectured extensively, including a kind of permanent lecture series at the Architectural Association. And she's also currently a lecturer in design in the technology faculty of the Open University. She has had, and probably all of you are familiar with this, a continuing relationship with the magazine AD, Architectural Design, or maybe X Architectural Design. And this really is an example of her engagement with contemporary architecture as well as historical issues. And right now, in addition to all of the material which many of you have read that she has published on Soviet architecture, she's preparing two very major works that we can all look forward to. The first one is the first study ever published really about Soviet town planning, and the other is a general history of Russian architecture. So we'll all await these works, which will really fill a gap that has long existed in the English language literature. So here she is, Catherine Cooke.
Well, that's kind of dazzling. I'm not sure I can quite live up to any of that, but that's your fault, not mine, simply. I may also disappoint you, so I'm trying to do the right thing for this microphone. I suspect a lot of you have come for some zappy new imagery which you can apply to the next project. And I may slightly disappoint you in that, but perhaps there's something, I hope, a little more substantial or will last you a little longer in your careers, some of the younger of you, in what I am going to say. Those are definitely not my slides, so I don't know where those come from. Maybe those are the wrong carousel. Oh, well, they sort themselves out. They can hear what I'm saying. Let me just say some introductory things. Perhaps they can't hear, I don't know. Never mind. I should just explain perhaps that the title that you read on the posters was a little bit obscure. It was supposed to be Constructivism, a contemporary view. which I hope is something more straightforward than actually what Bob, who didn't quite understand my English accent, I think, Bob, actually wrote. What I'm going to talk about is not, as I say, so much constructivism, very little indeed, constructivism as visual imagery. What has interested me over the years, and as Margaret rightly said, I'm an architect, not at all an art historian, is thinking about the design process, wherever one finds it. And this is what has been my concern, really, with constructivism. Two things in particular, perhaps, I want to focus on this evening. One is their view of architecture's role, its cultural role, in a particular society, and in their case, in their own society. And the second thing is the nature of design as a process. Oh, that's a big deal. That's actually exactly what we want. This concern, of course, with design as a self-conscious activity, which is something which to some extent runs through the 19th century, even in Russia. I'm not going to deal significantly with precursors as far back as that. What I am going to deal with is essentially three models of what the components of that process might be, what kinds of concerns architects might be considered properly to address, and how they might be properly organizing their design work and proceeding in design at a theoretical level. Now, I'm going to talk about three models in particular, of which you'll be glad to hear the major one is constructivism. The other two are essentially there to point up the specificity, as I see it, of the constructivist approach. And these are all examples of people looking at what should be the factors to be taken into account in design. And here in SCI-Arc, with your Vitruvian texts that I find all over the literature, you won't be, I think, thrown by the breadth of those concerns as they're defined by these people. The first of them, as we shall see, is somebody who is looking at the turn of the century at design, not specifically architecture, but the making of technologically constructed objects through the eyes with the intellectual structure that he has perceived in chemistry. The constructivists, as I see it, represent perhaps the clearest paradigm of self-conscious consideration of design, if you like, for what Banham would have called the first machine age, for thinking of a deterministic, essentially mechanistic kind, which took its inspiration, as we know, all over the world from engineering. But in this case, not just the forms of engineering, as we shall see when we look at both the Moscow constructivists and Chernikov in Leningrad, but something deeper, which is first how the engineer thinks, and secondly, what kind of a process is characteristic of mechanical engineering as society's chief technique for shaping its environment. The third model I shall look at is basically, in broad terms, an information theory model of the sort that seems to me appropriate to the situation we're in today, the pluralist situation, a situation where nothing is deterministically understood, it is essentially probabilistic. And, as I say, essentially in order to sharpen up our understanding of constructivism. Very much, I have to say, as something which is not relevant as an approach to problem solving, in my view, or I think if you understand it genuinely, probably in anybody's view, to the present situation. We have moved on. Now, I want to just, I will give you some history. The bulk of what I shall talk about is how these ideas of the constructivists developed. Out of what was their approach to design? How did it develop, very particularly from thinking in other arts? those arts which are tending now to provide, here and all over the world, a formal vocabulary for a lot of architectural work. And I hope perhaps clarify what I see as the essential characteristics of those languages, specifically constructivist and supremacist, underlying their usefulness as kind of things to stick on drawings. Now, here what you see in these two introductory slides is simply a map of the Soviet Union to remind you essentially where we are, where some of them you are going to be in a week's time. Essentially, we're dealing here with a culture which is based in Russia proper, and which, as we'll see, owes a lot to Western thinking. We're talking about people in Moscow and Leningrad. We're talking, however, about a multicultural society. Soviet Union is a federation of extremely different nationalities, religious cultures, and so on. And it very much, even in the 20s, posed the problem of how you build for a specific society, not just how you solve your own problems, but generically, what do you derive from another culture as the basis for your architectural propositions for the future. And this slide on your right is a half page from the Constructivist magazine, just to really point out that question. At the top, you see a bit of vernacular housing somewhere in Central Asia, and it says the live East. Down at the bottom, you see crossed out in good constructivist graphics, a piece of Central Asian architecture of a historical kind. Crossed out because what they're saying is sticking on motifs, sticking on historic stylistic devices is not the way to create a new architecture that is appropriate to a particular society in its present state. You don't do it by sticking things on. You do it by analysis of technical factors, microclimatic factors, responses of that kind, social organization, and how it is generated form in the vernacular of that culture. So the live approach, the dynamic and genuinely responsible approach is the top one, not the bottom one. And what we're looking at with constructivism is really thinking about how to do that. If those are the components of the problem, in what way are they related between each other? In what way should the designer order them in his own work on a particular task? Now, here we start a little bit before the revolution with essentially our first model. This is a man called Engel Meier, who was an engineer and philosopher, a very characteristic combination at the turn of the century. At that time, as many of you may be aware, it was probably the same in the States. Chemistry was the frontline science. Many people in other fields of society dreamed of understanding chemistry. It was like today understanding electronics. It was an entirely new language, particularly in Russia. Mendeleev had observed the regularities that produced the periodic table. And so it serves a role intellectually that is perhaps a little difficult to understand now, but which is very definitely some kind of parallel to the position occupied in the structure of thinking by subsequently the machine. Now, Engel Meier was concerned with this problem, that technology is running wild in society, and you realize all this is happening later in Russia than elsewhere. This is why we're already in 1910. They can see that there is a future which is dominated by technology, and they can see that mankind as a whole has no philosophy for dealing with that new force. And his concern, and it's the title of this book here, was that there should be some philosophy of technology, Philosophia Techniki, as it says here. And he went round various congresses in Europe where philosophers were sort of under the influence of people like Freud, and thought he was completely loopy, saying we must have philosophy of technology. And nobody really listened to him, in particular when he started talking about his chemical model of what this philosophy should be, how it should be structured. Now I got one of these. Now here you see a page from his book. And you see, I will translate it for you. What he fundamentally says was that there are four classes of impulse, if you like, in our terms, four categories of intention, four areas of a brief, which must be in some way brought to bear on a design problem, what he calls an act of technological will. And as he says, any of these acts of will, design acts, can be described by that single formula, CHON, the formula of an organic, generic formula for an organic substance in chemistry, by which the chemist describes any one of the infinite number and diversity of natural bodies. Now, he takes here, you've got it in Russian, but you can translate it, I'm sure, into English, four substances, and he says an act of will, in our case, is a function of, as you see at the top there, a certain element of truth, a certain element of beauty, a certain element of dobro, that means well-being in a human social sense, and a certain element of pure utility. And these are the territory, the areas that have to be brought together in a task of design. Now immediately, if you look at that, you see the breadth of his concerns. That there is something about aesthetics, there is something which is pure science, there is pure technology, which is Polzu, and there is social benefit and disbenefit. And there's, I think you'll agree, it's, as we would say today, a very powerful model. That's to say, it describes a very broad range of situations. Here he is below, and I won't go into that, talking about the interesting situation that whereas in chemistry you can only have a positive quantity of a substance of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, in a design situation you can have a negative quantity, that there can be social disbenefit. A thing can be ugly. It can be a piece of, if you like, untrue science. It can be false in that sense, a misuse of pure scientific knowledge. And this I represent in this diagram on your right. You see here, if you can read it, I'm not sure if you can, truth, which is objective knowledge about the world, beauty, which is aesthetics, good, which is social or moral benefit, and utility, which is practical benefit, and in its pure form is pure technology. And the point is that these things are related, but there is no definition of how they are related. They have a kind of valency like a chemical atom, but what the nature of that valency is, what is the relationship between truth and utility, scientific knowledge and technological knowledge, disbenefit and benefit and aesthetics and so on, is not defined. It is merely stated that these have a relationship. Now, this model, this diagram on your left is an abstraction of the constructivist design method. I'll show you later how it came to be that they believed you must have a method, and how it came to be that this method was essentially a linear process. But it is a linear process basically because their model in the 20s was the machine. The machine was the thing that was going to transform Soviet society. It was Marx who had said that his followers' chief task was to understand the world, to analyze it, just as they would analyze a machine. And to them, even more than in the West, it was an intellectual model, a deterministic intellectual model about how society could be restructured. You see here, I've color-coded the same bits and the same colors. In their model, and we shall see this developing later, you start with social intentions. You proceed through certain technical possibilities, questions of function, utility. You look here at the building science aspect, and you formulate something which brings those together, which is essentially, they call it a social condenser, the first spatial diagram of a building. This is something, the idea of condenser we'll see later. It's something which is potent in the changing of society. That then is examined from the point of view of aesthetics, how you will build it first of all and how you will make it into a clear, self-expressive, self-descriptive building. So you have this sequence, this necessary sequence of the design process based, as I say, on the logic of the machine. A linear process, essentially, of the transmission of some kind of power or information, and an essentially deterministic one. If you do the right things, you'll end up with the right building, is the answer, is the idea. Now here I want, before we look at actually the history in detail of how this came to be developed, and look at some of the constructivist work, to just move on to the third of these models. As I said, principally in order to stress to you what I believe, which is, and I think you would not question, that this is no longer an adequate way of proceeding as far as we're concerned by the 1980s. That we are no longer in Bannon's very useful phrase, the first industrial revolution, in the first machine age. We're in an age which is structured by information, by microelectronics, by the transmission of extremely small elements of energy, which are extremely powerful in that effect. An age where, if this is the age of the machine, we're in the age of information. And this is a very standard, what we would call information theoretic model, whereby you have essentially a structure which will be probabilistic. You no longer believe that by doing the right things in the right order, you actually change the world or accommodate your clients in precisely the manner that you have conceived. You merely hope with a certain probability you will achieve a certain kind of effect. Now what we have here, and again the color coding runs through, is philosophies. Not one philosophy, not a Marxist, materialist philosophy, but a pluralist society in which there are as many philosophies, potentially, as there are people. But there are agreements about certain philosophical systems amongst groups in society, and we accept that they have an equal right to exist. As a result of those philosophies, we have certain conceptual models of the world which correspond to them. And those lead us to certain operational theories and models, understandings of how things operate in the real world, how we may structure them through our mental processes. And we have outside here, if you like, the present, and that is the state of the world in some future. We have a mass of things, and here you see an important difference from the constructivists. A mass of things, some of which are solid, some of which are purely abstract, informational, non-material, which tell us about the world, receptors, as one talks about in the terms of this kind of science. They may be statistics, they may be transducers that tell us something specific, they may be things we measure about the sizes of the space that we require, that an activity generates. But we class them all essentially in the same generic, abstract way as information. We then have a set of means whereby we can affect the world. Some of those are bulldozers, some of them are messages we can send to traffic flow systems, or messages we can send through symbolism, through the means of art, to populations for whom we are building and structuring their environment. We have effectors, things which affect the world. And the important thing, which I've already said, is that whereas here you believe that if you, as the constructivists did, if you do the right things in the right order, you get the right answer and you solve the problem. You make people live in a new way. We no longer believe that. We believe there are very many reasonable ways of going on, and that there is a constant back and forth between what we are learning about the world and our hopes in terms of affecting the world. which is only at best, only probabilistic. It is certainly not deterministic. Now, I want to stress that because I think that, as I said already, and I can't stress it too often, there may be, and I think I'll show why there are reasons to look at the formal vocabulary, formal language of constructivism today. And those reasons are essentially in order to make the distinction, as I see it, between that which, if you want the jargon, is perhaps appropriate to a deconstructive situation, deconstructive philosophy, and this, which is no longer how any of us believe the world operates or ought to operate. So theoretically, I venture to say that, much as I love them, the constructivists' thinking at this level is certainly, in my view, out of date. Now, you'll be heaving a sigh of relief. Here's some pictures that you may even recognize. This is before the revolution. And we see here work which is, of course, in no way directed to a social purpose. It is the work of artists. It's done purely in the manner of advanced artists, always, to try and express something they perceive as emerging in the world, as it were, out on the dew line, at a stage where these things are hardly understood by science or by anybody else. You've got here two movements in Russian art before the revolution. Emergent constructivism, and it's not yet even called that on the right, in this hanging corner construction of Tatlin's, counter-relief, as he called it. And here, this is Malevich. These are both about 1915. This is called Aeroplanes Flying. I chose one of suitably technological subject matter. Now, what we have here is people, Tatlin specifically at this time, looking at materials, looking at the absolute material reality of the world, interested in how tension is held in a wire, in how a plane embraces a space, how solids in other constructions occupy space, real materials in real space, as his slogan was. Here you have the opposite. You have no real space. This is suprematism. It's in a space which is, above all, a space of time as much as of more, in fact, than of any real dimension. There's no indication of how large this is. This is completely without concern for three-dimensional measurement or with real material. And it seems to me that the more clearly you can keep those two rather pure examples of these philosophies in your mind, the easier it is to see what use they could be as aesthetic resources, if you like, in the present situation. One of them is about, as I say, how things are put together, how they may come together logically in real space. The other is concerned with something much more experiential, something much more spiritual, and above all with time. Now, there's a revolution, just in case you didn't realize that. This is Lenin, of course, symbolizing the fact that there is now a social task. There are the clients, there is a philosophy, there is a political program, which has, first of all, to find some social format. And then, as the architects immediately leapt to volunteer themselves, it has to find a new spatial organization for itself, a new architecture. And this is essentially the task that constructivists and others undertook in the 20s. Now, there's just one or two little pictures here to bring home what that meant in a rather literally domestic way. It meant reorganizing the daily life of all the ordinary people, stopping them living as little families as far as possible, creating a new psychology by making them live collectively, teaching them politics, here looking after the children collectively while mothers go to work, trying here to get away from tiny little kitchens. These are from microfilm, and I'm afraid they're not at all good. But to reorganize the way that people live and through that to change their psychology. Here you see this is a worker who's got sort of washed up into a nasty bourgeois flat before the revolution. And that's an absolute example of how you'll never change anybody's psychology. These are actually from the Housing Cooperative Movement magazine in the 20s. Now we have here those two artistic movements in 1919, 1920. Both of them having seen on that hand Tatlin, on this side Malevich, that the revolution meant the opportunity to turn their purely abstract work into some raw material for functional tasks, to take on board the social program and the constructive tasks that presented. Now, here we have, let's deal with Malevich first, something which is now three-dimensional, which calls itself something to do with architecture, but which is still scaleless, which is merely an idea about certain ways of bringing volumes together, and is still without real dimension, without any real sense of in what space, or therefore what time it exists. Here, on the other hand, you see Tatlin. And I'm sure you know this image, the tower that he built. I won't go into what it was for. The tower that he designed, I should say, not built. It was an enormous structure in his intention. Now, the most important thing for us about that tower is the statement that he made when it was shown here on exhibition in Moscow. He made it with his students, and it was shown in a very important party occasion. And they issued a statement which was called The Work Ahead of Us. You can read it in various books in English translation. And there were a number of points he made in this in a very succinct way. It was quite a brief statement, sort of one-pager, which really are what set constructivism on its road, which led to the kinds of concerns that we shall see became the architect's concern. First of all, he said, the work that we did before the revolution, that stuff which you saw, was without function. It was the work of artists. But now the revolution offers us a chance to use what we learned, to treat that, in this key phrase, as laboratory work for the solution of practical tasks in the new society. In short, to turn ourselves into designers, but designers who recognize that abstract work, exploration of materials, their spatial properties, volumes, and how they can be brought together, is an essential piece of preparation. It's a kind of bank of usable information that is there when you tackle real design problems. Now, the other thing that he insisted upon, apart from things like the need to see painting, sculpture, architecture as one continuum and various general things like this, was that this new design activity, they didn't use the word design, but that's what is being described, required disciplines. It required research, and it required what the Russians call sciences, nauki, bodies of organized knowledge. What those would be was still as yet a little undefined. But that would be, it was to be an approach through disciplines. And I put on this particular slide because he said these disciplines which will emerge from materials and what we understand about their properties for design, these disciplines must have the same rigor as the rigor of classicism. And here this was when a model of the tower was exhibited in Moscow. This was what was Paris-Moscow exhibition in Paris in the Pompidou, was shown then to great amazing acclaim and extraordinary queues and crowds in Moscow. And it was done, of course, by art historians who know their history. And they very nicely displayed this model in the center of the great classical hall of the Pushkin Fine Art Museum. Just making that little point, for those who knew it already, about the importance of seeing the way forward as being through rule systems, through set systems of organized knowledge, rather than through merely intuitive leaps. No, Tatlin, in a way, disappears from the scene rather at this point. In fact, he was derided by constructivists later. as a man who merely built symbols, whereas they were trying to build the reality of the future society. To be, as they said, the craftsman of its working day, and to what we aim with our materials to construct, they said later, is nothing less than our whole new way of life. The building of symbols is nothing to do with constructivism. So Tatlin rather disappears from the scene. But there were young artists who took up these ideas, particularly in Moscow. And they formed themselves into all kinds of sort of research groups with rather strange acronym names. You may have seen them in sort of bundles of capital letters in books about this period. In Hook and Živ Skulptar and things like that they were called, which I won't attempt to explain to you in detail. But through these groups, they started to do artistic research. As yet, there was no real production, there was certainly no building, and they were still operating as artists, trying to understand a new way of thinking, to develop a new way of thinking for the situation they could see growing up around them after the revolution. Here you have on this side Rodchenko, 1919, we're in now 1919-20 again. And this is a page from Rodchenko's notebook for a certain day. It says at the top, 7th of September 1919. And he's going to do these exercises today, certain combinations of line, certain permutations of groups of lines, and he's going to do them in different colors and in different relationships to the background and so on. Now here what you see is, of course, an entirely new way of making art, a new kind of activity for artists who had previously been representational, as Tatlin himself in the pre-revolutionary period. Looking at ways elements, formal elements come together, and already something of a permutational, combinatorial idea is there. That is a painting by Popova, who was a painter in this group of the same date, looking at planes in space, the relationship between certain quite clearly defined planar elements of different colors. You can see that one is behind another. There is some sense of real three dimensions and of how these elements are ordered and assembled. And these people, here you see Rodchenko again, and very obviously here playing a kind of permutational thing. He's got circles and rectilinear elements, and there are different ways in which those may be composed according to certain rules. Certain of them are aesthetically satisfactory, certain of them are obviously rejected. Here, this is his grandson, later Lavrentiev, actually doing an analysis of some of his granddad's paintings here, just to make exactly this point. Here you have the three basic planar elements, and here you have circles being combined in different sorts of ways. And here you have a little more from the same period, 1919. You see here, this Rodchenko one is interesting because of what he calls it. It's called number, whatever it is, number 15, in his spatial inventory. There's already a notion, a very clear notion, that this laboratory work builds up something, if you like, in the bank. There is an inventory of possibilities being developed. And he's looking here, as you can see, at the ways that that right-angular joint between identical elements may be in one plane, in another plane, different kinds of joint here. This is another kind of exploration that he did, taking a geometrical form, dividing it into similar forms of different size, and applying certain kinds of rotation. Obviously, infinite numbers of compositions are possible. He is selecting, as any artist or designer does, select those which, in some particular reason, are aesthetically of some satisfaction to himself. Now you see there, growing up, a way of thinking. Combinatorial, serial as a result, looking not for one solution, but for a range of solutions that obey a certain set of rules. And already that's obviously something which has implication for design. Now, these chaps actually were in a bit of a muddle. They could see they were doing something different from before, but they didn't quite know what to call it. And they could see that what they did before, which used to be called composition in the art schools, was a bit more kind of messy. Like this, you sort of started somewhere and then did another bit and it wasn't quite clear. You're building up the whole object or the whole image as you go. There's no very clear relationship in a work like that between, no very clear indication of the spatial relationship of the elements and so on. Now what they did in order to try and get themselves sorted out was they had a sort of weekly chat session, little study group, and they said one week, well next week we'll come back and we'll all have done a composition and what they were already calling a construction. And we'll have a kind of crit and we'll discuss these things and see if it clarifies our understanding about what we're looking for now. And you see here two examples of these pairs. This is by a man called Meadow Netsuke, who you may know he was a constructive sculptor. That's actually a contradiction in terms, but produced abstract constructions. There are one or two in American collections. His composition, as we've seen, is quite clearly not very articulated spatially or in terms of the exact relationship of those elements. I chose this Meadow Netsuke's pair because here, more than with most of them, you have a very literally constructive work for the construction of his pair. Exactly, clearly defined relationship in space between the elements, the nature of the joint, what passes through, what penetrates, and so on. And it's essentially the people who believed in that who went on, as we shall see, to become constructivists. But in the group, there were people who believed, and this is one of the examples of them, a man called Gladowski, who became a very famous teacher of architecture, who believed that there was still value in the studies of visual psychology, that these sciences, which, for example, a man called Münsterberg in Harvard was developing in Germany, were the basis for building a rational architecture, as they called it. That rationality in architecture was something aesthetic and to do with the perception and expression of form, not to do with how form and its function are logically connected in that very explicit sort of way. How it is built up, they're concerned more with the end product. And you can see here Ladowski's composition and his construction are not awfully different. This is essentially a surface treatment of the same volume as he handles in his composition. Now, we pursue these two just a little bit, because apart from anything, these are the two key dimensions, the two key movements in Soviet architecture in the 20s, and come together in the teaching in the avant-garde school. Now here you have, this is Rodchenko doing the same kind of thing to larger scale with these little constructions of his, looking at the permutations that are possible with certain elements, certain rules of combination of these volumes. Building up, as we would say today, a kind of grammar of the possibilities. Here you have the students of Ladowski, and you can see this is expressive form, essentially sculptural. These are some of them student works, some of them Rodchenko's. These are all student works in the Koolhaas school. It's not clear quite what is the relationship, how these forms here, for example, come together, which is primary, which is secondary, what is the extent or nature of their penetration. And here you see, just for fun, these are actually groups of students. That's Stepanova, the wife of Rodchenko, and there's some of these little things on the shelf in the studio. And here in the same school, you've got, this is Krinsky, who is Ladowski's chief assistant, looking through a whole range of these kind of rather sculptural, expressive things, trying to express dynamism, weight, and this kind of abstract, essentially, central things. Now here, just before we leave this rationalist lot, there's been an enormous number of bottles somewhere. You have from the same date, 22, 23, two schemes. This, you may know, this is the Palace of Labor scheme by the Vesnin brothers, who were emerging now as leaders amongst the young artists, leading them towards architecture. It was a competition which I won't go into. They didn't win it, but this building got third prize, this project. And it was seen by the constructivists, the young chaps at the time, and particularly in the future through the 20s, as the canonical building of constructivism. First time anybody had done anything at this sort of scale. And for why? First of all, it's obviously a logical concrete frame. In purely technological terms, it is coherently constructed. And then secondly, because it was an entirely new type, it was to be an assembly, a set of assembly halls for the new committees and councils of the working people. And it was without precedent. There had never been such a thing before. How would these assemblies come together? What would be the atmosphere? What would be the relationship between these groups? How would they form themselves in some kind of politically coherent operation? And so they saw it as canonical because it was a new brief generating an entirely new and logically constructed volumetric composition plan form itself. Now here, this was to stand actually rather close to that one in the center of Moscow. By Krinsky, you see Ladovsky's colleague. This is a skyscraper. Actually, the KGB is about here. This is just beside where the KGB is now. Composed entirely as a piece of sculpture. Composed to make another vertical in the center of Moscow alongside the historic vertical, to really communicate something about the scale and power of a socialist city in the 20th century within the historic fabric that you see here. You can see it's fairly, well now I guess that's fairly trendy looking, but in the 20s it would have been considered dangerously unconstructive, I think particularly that bit. But it is generated by external and essentially sculptural perceptual concerns, whereas that is generated by the inner logic of the problem and how you build it. And those two approaches, when we see the constructivist design model, they very much took on board the work of these rationalists. It had a role, as you've already seen. There was a point at which you refine and make perceptually expressive the form that you've generated, but it's not the primary generator of form. Now, in 22, they'd had these discussions, sort of every Wednesday, or I forget what day it was, in this little group called INHUC, the Institute of Artistic Culture in Moscow. And you can read, actually, in the Rodchenko book, which came out last year by a man called Han Magomedov, I'm sure it's available here, wonderful transcripts of some of their discussions. Actually, verbatim, they kept notes, kind of minutes of what they were discussing. And it's quite fun because you can see that basically they're grappling. They really can't understand what each other's saying to them. What is this construction? I don't understand about composition and all this. It's very reassuring, I can assure you, if you're used to history being full of awfully clever people who are never indicted. But out of this came a development of these ideas about method and about discipline. And the key figure in this is this man whose book you see the cover of here, Alexei Gun. Gun was an oddball. He was a kind of typographer, designer. He did a lot of things. And he'd read a lot of Marxism, and he was particularly the person who made them take on board the implications of the new ideology to address its intellectual requirements, its intellectual structures, and so on. And they couldn't understand Gun at all. They kept on saying, we cannot understand what Comrade Gun is talking about. In particular, when he started to talk about these three disciplines, as he saw it, of constructivism. This is a little piece of graphics from his book, from this book, which has got some splendid pages of very bold constructivist typography. Now, there were a number of things. It was really Gun who said constructivists must get organized and they must have a set of disciplines through which they work. He doesn't yet use the word method, but he uses repeatedly the words discipline, and that they must be organized in their approach to their work, not least so that it was something transmissible and it was an open process, open to public critique and participation. And these are the three disciplines that he framed up, formulated in general terms, defined. Tectonica, factura, and constructia. Now, you can find a number of otherwise reasonably reputable books which completely misrepresent what these things were, what they meant. And here I think it's useful if you can recall the sort of territory that man Engel Meier was trying to define. Some notion of a relationship between social intentions, for example, and technology. Some notions about a way of thinking, the requirement to have some intellectual substance to your theory, if you like, behind your description of the process. Here we have tectonica. These, he said, are the disciplines of constructivism. This is what we must formulate, refine, and teach. This is how people will design. Now, tectonica, this is the difficult one and the interesting one. Tectonica comes from the word tectonics in geology. It's not from technology. And this is what his mates couldn't understand. They kept saying, Comrade Gunn goes on about geology and we do not understand what he is talking about. And if you understand what tectonics is, it's essentially the science of how shifts occur in the very inner structure of the Earth. Plates of the inner core move around and so on. It's to do with very deep restructurings. And tectonica, he said, is to be the science of those deep changes in society and how the interface between those underlying structural changes and the way that society uses its physical material, how it distributes material in its environment. Now, if you think that is, as it were, the crunch, I mean, as we all know in design, there is some broadly political, broadly social, philosophical, deep structure within a social situation, within perhaps a specific brief, but here a whole society, which it's one's job to identify, to get, as it were, the feeling for, in some way to describe, and to see what that means for how material is to be distributed. And his concern is with a science that will describe the interface, chart that interface at a societal level. Very difficult concept, and it's no wonder they couldn't understand it, but extremely important. Bringing together the largest scale, most abstract thing and the most concrete thing. Factura is easier, and factura is how you actually handle a material, what it will do, how you process it and shape it. Constructia is then also open to much misunderstanding. This is the word from which constructivism comes. There is an entirely different word, stроительство, which describes construction as you do it on a building site, so to speak, in Wellington Boots. Constructia comes essentially from linguistics, and it means construction in the sense of the construction of ideas in a sentence. How ideas are put together. It is, as they said, the unifying and structuring force in constructivism. And so you've got here these three things which a designer must understand and understand the relationship between. This very difficult thing about social structure and its implications for the distribution of material, how actually you handle that material, and this intellectual dimension, which is how, if you like, you structure the whole, how you see the larger process. And much of constructivism, as we shall see, is to do with giving some greater definition, particularly in architecture, to those areas broadly defined, demarcated in that way. Now, this I put on, this is a drawing actually by one of the constructivists, not a mainstream one, a rather nice man called Goltz, which is Moscow in 25. Just a little street scene. And I put it on because this is the other important thing in Gunn's theory, in Gunn's book. He looked at the cities that they'd inherited from the old regime, and he said, these cities with their funny little spaces like this and their small buildings are absolutely obstructing our social reconstruction program. We cannot organize in those little buildings ministries, Soviets, meetings of the workers, and so on. and nor basically are the street spaces that we've inherited adequate to mass meetings, to gatherings of the proletariat, and so on. And the important, conceptually important thing that he said was that these cities we inherited are actively counter-revolutionary. That's to say, they are a negative force. They are obstructing the revolution. And what we then see the constructivists doing is turning that idea from a negative to a positive. That very important phrase that I mentioned when we looked at their method, the social condenser, is concerned with exactly this, with making form, architectural form, which is a positive catalyst of social change. Where if a building or a set of urban spaces can obstruct social change, conversely, the right organization of space can assist, can help people live in a new way, and it can thereby change their psychology and build the new society. So you have those two ideas, that there must be a method, there must be disciplines, that they cover this territory. Tectonica, factura, constructia are the area that must be in some ways analyzed and defined, and that built form is either an obstructor of social reconstruction or could be potentially a positive catalyst of social change. Now, this is Ginsberg. This is the leader of the constructivist architects. He's about a bit younger than the Vesnins, but older than most of the students. A very interesting man, educated in Italy, educated also as an engineer. His father was an architect. And he wrote, if you like, the next manifesto of constructivism, which was a book of which you see a spread here, called Style and the Epoch. It owed quite a bit to Corbusier's Vers in Architecture. They were beginning to receive l'Esprit Nouveau as soon as the blockade ended, and some of these pictures, actually, I did go through it once, are actually cribbed from l'Esprit Nouveau. Offset from the French book. But the analysis here of the role of the machine is altogether something more subtle, I think it has to be said, than anything in Korb at that date or later. This is, to some extent, Gunn had talked about the role of the machine and the parallels between machine thinking and a kind of Marxist philosophy. But although this is not larded up with much Marxism, it's very much a development of these ideas of the machine as a paradigm for thinking in their time. And whereas Korb, of course, looked at things like this and said they're kind of nice shapes, and aeroplanes is jolly nice streamlined things, and houses should look like aeroplanes, the analysis here, as we'll see later, is much more subtle. And in this book, apart from developing ideas about method as a principle, Ginsberg makes, as he says, a two-stage analogy between the machine and the building. He says if you look at a machine, it's organized in a certain linear way. It has parts which transmit energy or direct force from one to the next. And you can make an analogy between a machine and a factory. A factory is, as he said, a commune, a collective of machines, and it's already something which contains human beings, which has to take into account human scale, human environmental requirements, and so on. And then you can make, as he said, a second stage to the analogy, which is between the factory and any other form of architecture, non-industrial architecture. Between the factory and housing, or the factory and, let's say, a workers' club or something like that. And the elements of this analogy are two things. They are what they call the scheme of equipment, which is the stuff at a particular place. It might be in a machine, it might be, say, the carburetor. In a factory, it might be a cluster of machines sort of folding paper or something. In a piece of architecture, it might be the equipment of a kitchen or a specific activity area. And you need to understand those and see them as elements, and then you need to understand the flow between them, the flow diagram. And those are the two elements, the flow and the discrete events, which we should be using to build up the new spatial diagrams, as they said, of new social types for a new society. And there's a lot of very interesting history there, which again is far more sophisticated than anything in Cooke. It just kind of takes the bits he likes, about how there is a cyclical process of growth and decay of what he calls constructive periods, when you have new social tasks, new building technology, and they mature and then decline, and the process starts again. And you can see this through history and architectural history. Now here you see, this takes it a little further. Here you see the development of this idea in later work. This is a collage of certain things from 27. Looking at, here's the machine, here is a factory, applying these processes, which of course in Germany were also being studied, time and motion study, par excellence, they came from here, and were being used amongst much else in Ford factories, and they'd read Ford's books and they knew all about that. And here you see workers' clubs and so on, studying kitchens in terms of flow and the economy of movement. And on that side, I just put on this, it's actually a poster from the great campaign that was going on in the 20s to get industry and particularly work processes rationalized. A Taylorist campaign, very directly inspired by the Taylorist movement here. And that was, of course, one of the stimuli to this. This is quite nice, and the reason I put it on is, well, what it says is, let us take the storm of the revolution in the USSR and bring together with it the pulse of life in America and do our life with the precision of a chronometer. Now that is there's a very important idea there, which is that there is a distinction between the technical wherewithal, the technical knowledge, the techniques, and political content and how they're used. And this is very much a theme of Soviet relationship with the Western world at the time, that we take the objective developments, but we don't take the political connotations, the political associations or structure. So you have here the storm of the revolution combined with the objective technology available from the United States, and you work with this degree of precision. Well, this is addressing workers who don't even possess watches, and they all arrived, rather drunk for work at about midday and thought that was okay. But it's very important as an influence on thinking in architecture, how you generate a new spatial organization around a new brief. Now here, this is, you've probably seen this, this is the cover of their magazine, which the Constructivists launched in 26, after they just formed a constructivist architectural group. There you can see the design is by Alexei Gun. He's a member of the group, Rodchenko. They're all in there together. You can see also that it's published with a certain amount of text in French and in German. It's very much an international magazine. It's the only proper architecture magazine in the Soviet Union in the 20s. And this was the main vehicle through which they developed their theories, in particular through a series of articles, theoretical articles by Ginsberg. They obviously emerge from discussions amongst the whole group, but Ginsberg is the man who clarifies, articulates, and so on. And this, there's no intention that you should actually read this in detail. You can find it published, but it's a chart I made just tracing the logical development of ideas towards the constructivist design method here, from the very earliest writings of Ginsberg through a series of papers. And it's very interesting to see these ideas taking shape and acquiring some practical definition. Here you have distinctions, for example, between theoretical questions and operational questions. You have, very importantly, a distinction between what today we would call the state variables, the general environment in which you're solving a problem, social, philosophical environment, and the decision variables of a particular problem. And you see here a statement already of the various stages in a design task, and in this developing through to a very distinctive method. Now, here we are back in slightly greater detail to this diagram we had at the beginning. I don't propose to look at it in enormous detail, and that's why I reduced it here to this degree of simplicity. But very important that you start with a social a social philosophy, and here socialist principles which underlie everything done in the Soviet state, which determines certain things, a collective way of life, the notion of a unified philosophy and method, architecture being part of a larger social plan, and certain ideas about norms, types, and standardization. And from those, you have a particular brief, you analyze it in terms of its, as you see here, static dynamic requirements of the human activity. You look at the building science stuff, you build this first diagram, this first almost dimensionless, but if you like, topological diagram of what that building is. A new form of housing, a new form of social building like a workers' club, whose intention is to change the way people live. It will be a kind of, this is an analogy from essentially electrical equipment, a condenser. It will intensify energy in the environment and force people gradually to live in a new way and adapt their psychology thereby. There are further stages of development of the thing technically, and then you look at it in terms of its aesthetic and perceptual properties and so on. And at the end, you have a logical building unconstrained by models handed down from the past, what we're all aspiring to always achieve in architecture. Very much argued through their papers in terms of the logic of the machine. Here, I just put these on slightly more detail, just to indicate to you that there is more detail, and actually I've written about it. You can go and read the stuff in more detail in AD. It was all presented in one paper, which is about education and the role of laboratory work as building up the elements of this, this model, this approach. You see, take the problem apart, first object, and so on, various things. Then you come on to the perceptual questions, taking on board there the work of the rationalists who actually were teaching in the same building as them. Looking here, very importantly, at the elements of architecture itself, surface, volume, how volumes interrelate. This is making a clear statement of your architectural intentions through mastery of these elements of form. And here, very importantly, you see the types of transformation. And we start to refer here to the sort of work which Rodchenko and co. had been doing, which he had been the leader of, looking at how forms may come together and how you respond logically to a change in the requirements of your task. And then some things about industrial processes and so on. Now, this is very important because it's here, and particularly in this specific idea, that one has another body of work, which also passes under the same name, Constructivism, by this man Chernikov up in Leningrad. Now, this is a little piece from that paper. Very important. The greatest danger, says Ginsberg, is the canonization of forms, of certain forms becoming fixed elements of the architect's vocabulary. Constructivism is leading the battle against this phenomenon. It studies the basic elements of architecture as something continuously changing in response to changing conditions of the form-making situation. Very typical wordy Soviet expressions, trying to formulate something new. It never admits the fixing of forms. Form is an unknown X which is always evaluated anew by the architect. Now, that's right. Here we have examples which I think bring home the point about the function of that when you get to design. To put it very briefly, having done that kind of thing, you are building up a vocabulary which enables you then to proceed logically in at a larger scale in a design task. Very important element of this work is focused on here, which is precision, quantification of the properties of space, of volumes, of architectural organizations. I don't know if I can focus it just a little bit more. There. Some very nice little graphics here, slightly suprematist. What this says is architects do not imitate the forms of technology, but learn the method of the engineer. That's another, as far as I remember, directly from L'Esprit Nouveau. And much as they respected Core, there's an element there of, if you like, warning to their students not to be quite so superficial about it. Now here you see a statement which says, architects, this is how to understand the basis, the materialistic bases of the aesthetic of constructivism. And the way you understand it is by quantification. This is an engineer explaining how that form arrived, not by thinking this is jolly nice and all streamlined and things, but by doing sums. And by understanding the properties of form with that degree of precision. And some of the most outstanding work that they did, certainly in relation to the very short time they were operating, was in showing the implications of that kind of approach. Here you see them looking at housing problems. This was what was being built, conventional bourgeois apartments to stuff the workers in, because nobody could think of anything else. When building got going, this is what was going up. They took that with all its norms and the criteria the local council liked to apply and so on, studied certain of its properties, spatially in terms of flow, and produced a whole new set of possibilities for housing that took out a lot of the domestic functions, socialized them, and would help people to progress towards a collectivist way of living. Here you see, this is a very interesting bit of work, looking at certain sections for housing. Here, this famous split section, which Cobb later cribbed from them. Here, a more conventional one. Examining them in the terms that the city council liked to look at their plans, which was usable space to circulation space. And this one, not surprisingly, comes out the best, type F. And this becomes one of their major sort of demonstrations of the results of their logic and of new ways of organizing housing. And they built certain projects demonstrating those types that they had evolved. Now this is par excellence the building as catalyst. This is housing which has taken out many of the bourgeois family functions, most of the cooking, most of the recreational space, and provides it collectively in the building here. It's not totally collectivized, but it helps people to live in that way. It's a catalyst of social change. And it looks very sad here. It's a little bit in better condition now. That's where the double height units are expressed at the end there. There are various other units here, really little micro apartments, helping people to get away from this notion of the family as the basic social unit and to think of themselves as part of something collective. These pictures were taken here when it was new in 28, 29. You can see the Corbusian pilote. There's a nice toit jardin at the top there and all that. And the aesthetic, indeed, is somewhat taken ready-made and I think quite reasonably from Corbusier. But this is the crucial thing in a way, that small units for individuals of total equality, man, woman, or whatever, and then for married couples, perhaps with a child, are matched to a social building as part of this process of helping to break down the family mentality, the bourgeois mentality, and help people to live in a new Soviet way. And the analysis of those housing units is, as I say, the crucial thing. They proved that these were a more economic use of resources, quite apart from being some kind of socially far more dynamic spatial organization. Here are just another couple of bits of work, or at least examples from the work of one of their diploma students, a man called Krasilnikov, who is looking here at the characteristics, the properties of certain layouts for an administrative building. And he's a very interesting man because he sees that the old approach that all the others are doing is still only looking at certain discrete solutions. They may have been generated out of examination of many alternatives, but they are discrete alternatives. And he was obviously a very bright mathematician in school. He understood calculus, probability theory, and he said you have to bring these areas of advanced mathematics to bear on this problem. And actually the studies he did, which are here of certain characteristics of evacuation time to usable space, and something here to do with thermal properties of heat loss and so on, and his studies of circulation in this putative city, although they're slightly simplistic in their logic, are actually very sophisticated as mathematics. We reworked this when I was doing this work in Cambridge. And it was quite a major computer program to work. It's quite funny, he made a mistake there, that little blip in the curve. I remember Lionel March saying it's a jolly funny curve. Most proper curves don't have little sort of dips in them like that. And when we did the maths, we found he'd made a mistake just there, and actually it should be a rather smoother curve, which is kind of reassuring again, you know, that occasionally even these chaps make mistakes. But the logic and the way of testing form, first of generating form by logical grammars and then testing the properties of alternatives, is crucial to their way of designing. Building up the first requirements and arrangements through this method. Now this is very important in a minute when we look at planning and we look at the complete change in their arguments at the end of the 20s. Here they are. I'm afraid this is a page from microfilms, rather scratched, but you see the whole of an article where again they're conducting a mathematical argument. In this case against, here's the diagram enlarged, against Garden City people who argued that you could scatter people in little houses as before, it was cheap. They would still go down the end or whatever it was, wherever they went, to collective facilities. It was only 5 minutes walk or 10 minutes walk. That the pipe lengths and so on were reasonable for the economic possibilities that were available to them. Now the constructivists said, this is not only socially disastrous, you will never beat the bourgeois family psychology by this means, but more importantly, it is uneconomic in terms of time and in terms of materials. You must compress the people, or at least you must compact the people into these larger blocks where the facilities are there in the block. It must be, there's a nice piece of graphics here, says extensive or intensive development. This is extensive, this is intensive. And they argue in terms of travel times, how long it takes somebody to get down to the place where they have breakfast, how long it takes them to get to the transport, and so on. And in terms of pipe lengths and surface of roads, and so on. Dynamic measures, as you see, measures to do with movement. And they say very clearly at the time, this intensive solution has certainly some disadvantages. But in the present state of our technology, we are forced to accept those disadvantages, to live with them, because this is the optimum solution for our present state of particular transport and servicing pipework and so on. Now that is very important in a minute when they completely reverse their arguments. Now just a little quickie to give you some nice as it were, recognizable pictures. And to focus on that bit of work which is formal research, which they identified as the key to creating a logical and coherent building, but did not themselves do the most detailed work on. The most detailed work in this area was done by a man really quite unrelated to them, called Chernikov, up in Leningrad. I suspect you know about Chernikov a bit already. Several things I've been asked to sign indicate to me that certain of his things are circulating here. He was up, here's an extraordinary chap, here he is, as it says here, called Mephistopheles, and an he believes that here in the machine is a kind of logic which ought to be, as the constructivists themselves believed, was the proper logic for their social philosophy, their political philosophy, and their state of development. And what we see in Chernikov is essentially a bringing together of elements of suprematism and constructivism. This is two of his books, from 27 and this one 31. This is in fact work that was done earlier, they both are. But I put them on because this is, as it were, symbolizes the suprematist origins of his work. And this, by its very typography, the constructive logic that he then developed. Here this is called the construction of architectural and machine forms. And immediately you see these two things treated, as it were, in one breath. Now here, this is just a kind of summary, and the most important thing for us really is here of what Chernikov is focusing on. And you see it's a subsection of the design process as understood by the Moscow constructivists. The aim of his educational program is to study the fundamentals of architecture in sequential order of increasing complexity through specific, clearly defined tasks, through exercises. And you will study the elements of form, first of all, in a plane, lines and planes, in space, planes, surfaces, volumes, and very important, the types of constructive joint, how forms may come together coherently by one penetrating another, embracing another, clamping, mounting, interlacing, coupling, so on. I just put that on because those are some of the other topics which are addressed in his discussions of design, new anti-classical aesthetics, the dynamics and aesthetics of rhythm, and so on. He's in no way only concerned with this, but that is the bit we're focusing on now. Now, these two are obviously exercises in line and plane on line and surface in a plane. And I put them on there both from the book Construction of Architectural Machine Forms, really to make a very important point, which is that none of this teaching, particularly in Chernikov, but it's implicit with the others, is really geared to a specific aesthetic. What Chernikov in particular is making clear to his students, is training them to understand, is that there is no one, it's a very pluralist approach, if you like, there is no one approved grammar of the combination of forms, of the assemblage of forms, which is appropriate for every situation, or indeed which is satisfactory to every individual. You've got here two examples. Obviously, these are essentially the same elements, lines, a circle, and rectangle. And here they've been assembled in this exercise in what one might call broadly a suprematist approach, suprematist aesthetic. There's not any real clear sense of what is in front or behind, of how they interconnect, of really a sort of scaleless perspective feeling in a distance. Here are the same elements combined in what one might call a kind of neoplasticist approach. Absolutely clear statement, according to some coding, of which is dominant over the other at each intersection. They fairly clearly are in one plane. And the point is that you're not actually learning to do one or the other, there is a choice. What you're learning is to do either of them or any other, to apply any other set of aesthetic principles coherently, and to understand what you're doing. Now here, these are just some models out of this exhibition I did about Chernikov, which models had been made at the time, but there are none surviving, and we have no pictures of them. So these were made for me in the university for the exhibition. Here you see the elements of form, plates, rods, cubes, and so on, being studied in different ways. Here you see types of joint, which is perhaps the most important area of his formal teaching and research. Here, this is examples of penetration. One form penetrates into another. It doesn't, in all cases, go through, though it may go through, as here. Circular forms, quadrilateral forms, again, circular forms. Very beautiful, some of them, and there is no suggestion that aesthetics no longer play a part, or rhythm, or proportion, or any of those things. But it is the logic of the possibilities that you're learning to be the master of. Here you see this is embracing. It may be rectilinear, it may be curvilinear, but one form is embracing another, goes around it but doesn't completely go around it. This is mounting. They tend to have, I have to admit, these rather sexy sort of, it's a very extraordinary crude vocabulary, and they are actually very sexual terms, there's no getting away from it. Embracing and mounting are typical examples. You may laugh, I was quite nervous when I first put these on the wall in London when a friend of mine had drawn my attention to quite how explicit it all was. Luckily the journalists were too witless to pick it up, or I was about to hide. But this is mounting. You see the form penetrates but not right the way through. Here is an example. These are Examples to make the connection with Ladovsky and co. These are exercises in a certain form of expression, here of transparency, the state of transparency, here of weight. And that could very much be an exercise that Ladovsky's students had done in Moscow. In fact, he was accused of having copied them, and he said, they published nothing, I don't know what they did, don't blame me. It's just the same logic and the same kind of study. I am cutting this short a lot, of course, but here then, having developed a form, you would color it. And you would learn to color it according to a certain science of the use of color and the expressive potential of color, and certain explicit intentions that you had about a building, about a form, and then subsequently about a building. Now here again I put on two purposely contrasted examples to make the same point that I made before, that there's no one aesthetic being particularly favored in this, this philosophy, this training, this approach. These are both by Chernikov or students, one never generally knows quite which, out of his books. Here obviously you have a thing which is in a sense non-constructive. The structural supports are concealed, it's a kind of Art Deco, it's a concern with surface, with certain kinds of dynamic playing over a surface. Here you've got an intensely constructive thing, and he agrees that is not always an appropriate kind of logic. Such rigor is not always appropriate to the solution or the mood of the situation. But the parts are absolutely clear in terms of what they are structurally, how they interconnect, the materials that are being used and their general properties and so on. So both of them and many others are examples of the approach. Things you have to master, you have to learn to use form with that degree of precision. Now, I mentioned before in passing that constructivists changed their view dramatically. Argued one thing about density in the middle of the 20s and then argued something quite different, as we shall see at the end of the 20s. And this is where we begin to come to something which is the same leap, I think, as the leap between those two models, between the deterministic mechanical model and the more probabilistic one that we're more interested in today. This is just a little background. This is Moscow planning of the 20s. The 1923 plan by Shusev for a mild restructuring of the city. Here's parts of that developed by some of the students. Here by Colli, actually, as a student who later was the, may interest you, the executive architect for Korb's building in Moscow. But you see here an essentially entirely conventional view of the city. It's a kind of blob with a certain inner structure, and here this is the way that the young constructivists learned to see it. By the end of the 20s, there was a major program going on in the Soviet Union of what they call automobilization, of motor car building, of lorry building, and so on. They had certain turnkey factories from Ford. You see here, we will fulfill the 5-year plan. This is the first Soviet Ford, written there, coming out of its factory in Nizhny Novgorod in 1929. And this is a book by a man who was battling for this ever higher aspirations in terms of motor car production. Motor cars and automobiles in general, free vehicles. Now here again, this is microfilm, but it's, as it were, the real thing from the magazine, the Constructivist magazine, in the summer of 29. There was a lot of debate about the proper shape of cities, socialist cities going on, which I won't get into, generated by the developments of the 5-year plan. And what was essentially happening was that conventional centroidal blob-like cities like this were being built all over the countryside, more or less well, in crude planning terms. And these people saw that there was no real rethink going on in terms of what a socialist city should be, far less in terms of the implications of this kind of space-liberating, time-shortening technology. There was electrification going on. You could now transmit energy, as they said, instead of carrying fuel. And there was going to be a quite different kind of relative accessibility and so on growing up as a result of this explosion of motor cars and buses and so on. And this is a page from an article by an economist who worked with them called Ochitovic, called On the Problem of the City. And here in this drawing you see his analysis of how certain functions of the city no longer require to be physically contiguous as they were before, that they could be moved out. They could be literally decentralized. The city, there could be a process, as they said, of disurbanization. Distance, as they said, is now measured by time. And time reverses all the old, this new measure of time reverses all the old arguments about contiguity within the city and this whole old capitalist structure of the centroidal city. And here you see the project, the proposals that they put forward, very controversial at the time, for an alternative form of settlement. This is their ribbon of settlement. They said there will be highways across the countryside anyway for these vehicles to connect the major points of industry and so on. There should be no more cities. Cities will cease to exist. The population will be integrated, this old dream of Engels and Marx and so on, of integrating the rural and urban populations by them all living along this linear route. Distance is measured by time, as here, and according to the frequency of requirement of certain facilities, they will be provided, as they said, according rhythmically along this ribbon of settlement. These are post offices, creches, and there's a different curve, a different time rhythm distribution for each of those facilities along this ribbon, where everybody lives in little separate houses. Now, this, of course, was the complete opposite of what they'd argued before. And you can see them almost the kind of excitement when they have put different values into that design model of theirs for the variables, and out comes a different answer. Here you see this is quite jolly. This is actually the little Ford motor car with the kit of parts for the little house in the back. And you find a plot and you set up the foundations and you erect this little house. And it's quite nice, they say, if two people marry, they can move their houses together, and if they kind of unmarry, or whatever it was called in a socialist society, they move their houses apart. Everybody has this kit of parts, and that is his basic requirement and ration as an individual in a socialist society. Here, this is a study of different building materials that are available in different parts of the Soviet Union, and how panel systems for this will be made out of local building materials, and therefore they will differ in different parts of the country. And here there are various ideas about ways that they can be grouped. Now, one thing I should just go back to there, which I perhaps didn't stress enough here. When we come on to this quite different work, the notion here is that you have a sort of parallel banding of facilities. Certain things are available along the road. Access is by this route. You then have completely free choice. You can move off to a range of facilities at different points and onto your house. And your route may therefore be one of many routes according to what you select to be your particular desires and requirements and social interests in that day. And all of this is theoretically equally accessible to any individual. Distance is now measured by time. And you're still only 5 minutes away from a vast range of facilities, although you're several kilometers away from it. Their argument against the people who said was, but they're all in cottages now, they're all living in things like this, they'll become bourgeois again, was that you have other forms of communication. You no longer need, as the other people were arguing, to assemble people together at high density in order to develop a certain psychology amongst them. You have literally the transmission of information at a distance. They use the word television, and I think they have just picked it up from very early things in the West. They certainly didn't have it. But there is transmission by radio of information, and the beginnings you see here of the kind of mental environment, communication which is not dependent on contiguity, which we're familiar with today. And as I say, this zoning of a range of facilities, this parallel zoning of the city, rather than the grouping of them specifically around certain nodes and limiting of choice. Now, I carefully chose at this point something which was not local here in order not to be in any way controversial or to overstep what was legitimate here, I think, to say. These next projects are generally from Bernard Tschumi. And really what I just want to do in these last few slides is to look at some of the parallels between the sort of thinking we see now and that later work of the constructivists, which was generated by that method, but was a kind of explosion of what they thought the method was going to lead to. Distance is measured by time. Physical contiguity is no longer required. There are a range of quite different options. There is a kind of pluralism about life. People are not forced to do, sports one day and go to the workers' club the next. There is a freedom along that route to select the activities that constitute their lifestyle within a certain vocabulary. And I think that one sees there already in terms of this discussion of accessibility over time, of information being not transmitted through contiguity, the beginnings of the kind of information approach that the world, but with the intellectual world, if you like, that we're in today. It was said at the time by the Communist Party, this may be right for the future. The constructivists may be right about the future, they said. Disurbanization may be the future, but it is not right for the psychology and the state of technology today. Now, I just put on these, probably familiar to you. This is Opera House in Tokyo by Tschumi. Again, this same idea that there is no predetermined selection of activities which constitute a lifestyle, that you enter at a certain point, that you choose certain eating options, certain performance options, and the thing is a range of possibilities rather than a specific recipe in the way that, for example, a workers' club of the 20s might have been to the constructivists. This I put on, this is Parc de la Villette, really only because it's a rather simple sort of analogy. It's a discussion of rhythm, of time as the experiential dimension of moving through space, rather than volumes and so on. It's something to do with your experience of events at a certain set of time patterns. Here, this is an interesting one. This is constructivists talking about how the city will evolve through certain states to a completely disurbanized, almost anodal network. This is a disurbanist state of society. This is the socialist pattern of settlement. This is what they inherited from the capitalist state, capitalist society. And with that goes the presumption that that is, if you like, for the age of the machine, the first machine age, mechanical engineering, physical contiguity. This is the world where there is transmission at a distance of information, energy in a wire, not coal in a lorry, and where distance is measured by time. Here I just put this on as a kind of example that we're familiar with today through this kind of work, of course, of this very clear distinctions between linear elements, nodal distributions of this kind of network of discrete options within a certain time frame and surfaces, kind of almost Chernicovian analysis, of course, lines, points, and surfaces. Here, just to carry the thing a little further, we find the same, of course, vocabulary developing here by Tschumi: intersection, repetition, qualification, distortion, fragmentation, the sorts of things which logically you can do to a form. And I just go back to that, really to make the point which seems to me the crucial one, that if you're looking in the ways we are now to make statements about a new kind of connection which is not necessarily physical contiguity, which is not logical mechanical structures of the kind we previously believed in the modern movement, this sort of understanding seems to me to be still essential, and I'm sure this is why it's being so much used. you need, as it were, to understand a constructive language in order to make a deconstructive statement. You have to understand what putting together is in order to say, look, it no longer is together. It may be separated in space rather than together. The language depends on you understanding that in order to make for the frisson, the negative statement. Here again, there's just another idea. This is again, of course, Tschumi. The permutational idea that there are a set of alternatives, the principles of combination and transformation of the elements. And because you understand the logical way to put them together, you can make statements of a very tense and potent kind about how those kind of connections are no longer what we're on about. This is constructivist. This is one of their little houses when they were doing this disurbanist thing, just to give you a kind of close-up. And the permutations for the organization of the space inside and so on. Super little houses. I always feel it'd be worth, mass production of those and you'd make a fortune, but I haven't gone into it yet. Here, this is, of course, the plan for Parc La Villette. And this is a Netsuke painting from early 1920s. And really, again, just to make the point without being too corny about the similarities, which are fairly striking, that it was absolutely legitimate in the eyes of these people. They would have seen it as legitimate, that one used their vocabulary, their experiments, much later, when one was operating in this kind of four-dimensional space-time mental environment as raw material for solving new kinds of problems. They saw it, as I've said, the key phrase that they came back to the whole time with this kind of work was that it was laboratory work. It was preparing a language which would suit a future problem. Here you have, this is a rather odd bit of Leonidov, and this is just to make the point about, a rather obvious point about constructive vocabularies and their current sort of utility. Here, this is again a Netsuke. This is, of course, Koolhaas, and I just, again, it's the same point that this is exactly what these people saw their work as being preparation for. Something at this scale, a piece of a city, a piece of some larger or smaller environment, scaleless, but to do with a vocabulary of spatial relationships. Now, finally, this is, again, Leonidov, who is a rather deviant member of the constructivist group because he's obsessed with kind of suprematist vocabulary of space and pure form. And the people who are trying to apply this method keep having to sort of defend this young, slight lunatic chap in their group. As he's the source, he attracts a great deal of criticism to their architecture. I've just discovered today that this book, although here in your shops it says Rizzoli, has actually emerged. It's arrived from Hong Kong since I left London. It's something I've been doing for the last few years with these two Soviet friends of mine. Andrei Leonidov is, of course, the son of Leonidov. I just mild plug, although there's not much profit to me from you buying the copies. I hope you will. Really to tie up one or two of the themes that I hope I've alluded to. His work is not particularly generated by this method, and in that sense he is a deviant. But the use of this suprematist vocabulary is very characteristic, and in that sense I think he's ahead of them. He's very much concerned in his projects with this larger space-time environment rather than the kind of mechanical contiguity and neat time and motion study, doing it all in your feet kind of unitary speed of movement and so on. And a lot of his work, I think that is why certainly it's being reused very widely, I think, by a lot of people like Hadid and Leonidov and so on, and Koolhaas and so on. The suprematist dimension, involving the idea of time and that kind of relativity. This I put on, which is probably Leonidov as you never saw him before. There's a lot of this kind of stuff in the book. This is a marvelous hillside that he did, all the facilities of a really completely decentralized, disurbanized kind of recreational park, center for pioneers on a hillside. And I particularly choose this one because it has this little classical building here. And it seems to me it just points up one of the issues that one has to face up to in this question of scale, and certainly it's a very urgent question in Europe at the moment, though I suspect not so much here. There's an enormous resurgence of classicism. At the same time as you have kind of a deconstructive movement completely dynamizing and completely destroying the static entity that a building of that conventional kind represents. And we have this very extraordinary situation that classicism is coming back. It's almost as strong, the kind of Kriya movement for that kind of urban form. I'm sure here it seems like another planet to you, but where I come from, this is a very real parallelism in two movements at a particular time, which appear to have completely contradictory premises. And certainly it seems to me you have to come to some conclusions about why it's happening in a state which is, as we know, electronic. We're all communicating by fax machines, if not more abstract, dematerialized forms of coding down the wires. And certainly this seems to me to point up that dichotomy. And to raise the question of at what scale you are concerned with this sort of mental explosion, with this new mental universe in which we all live, where the old paradigms are being absolutely questioned, where it seems to me you have a kind of what amongst the technologists I deal with would be a kind of systems view, a systems analysis going on, which is producing very new ideas about what are underlying structures or maybe non-structures. It seems to me that sort of information theory model is very much to do with a systems analysis of the world which at every point starts again, which looks afresh, which questions the whole time, and finds very unexpected formal, spatial, structural answers. And it seems to me that's something which is very much now, in a sense, architecture is catching up with. And that you have something else, which is, if that's the world of the mind, there is the world of the body, there is the sensual world, which is maybe requires a kind of physical repose, not here, certainly, but I'm talking as a European. When you operate in this extraordinary world where you're dealing with the whole globe and its different time zones, and, you know, bringing up California one minute, Moscow the next, as I do, really not quite sure in what real time or space you operate. That I think with us, we begin to recognize that you actually almost need your body and your sanity as a human being. Society's kind of coherence and stability to some extent depends on there being some other physical properties in the actual environment, which are not as disrupted, as uncertain, as, you know, where the probabilities are a little bit more secure. And in a way, the classical thing and the return of people like Kriya to us represents, I think, that sort of need. Somewhere in the middle, we have to find some new kind of architectural resolution of it. But I just digress into those things because they are the questions that I think we have to look at when we look at what's an appropriate way of designing today and what kind of model, if there is any model at all, we can have for the process. And certainly it's not that deterministic, linear, mechanical model which the constructivists devise. Although their formal research is certainly something, a useful resource in developing almost the opposite. Okay, right. If you have any questions, I'm delighted to deal with them as best I can. If you don't, everybody's at liberty to go and eat or drink. That's the end. I wasn't disillusioned you entirely by yourself. Yes, go ahead. Quite a bit. The important thing, I think, to realize there was a very short period of time. I'm supposed to repeat your question for the sake of the microphone, but The question was, microphone, that to what extent were these things actually built? They were operating only for a few years. And it always seems to me that the amount of, for example, housing that they built, using those new semi-collectivized units, demonstrating that nation of housing as a kind of catalyst social change, they built about 6 or 7 schemes of that kind in various towns of the Soviet Union. There's 3 in Moscow standing there, that one and 2 others. They have an enormous influence, certainly, on planning theory at the end of the 20s, in developing a kind of systems view of what the problem actually was of formulating a new settlement system. And I mean, in terms of building, what did they build? Quite a lot of housing schemes. There's some public buildings, a great deal of competition work, and so on. There wasn't a lot of building going on. A lot of the building was very conventional. And, you know, it depends, in quantitative terms, it was relatively little. In terms of its impact on thinking, it was very significant amongst the people who were genuinely concerned with a Marxist approach for the new way of doing things. To many vast areas of building activity, they probably never even heard of it. You know? I mean, was that what you meant? I mean, relatively, it's... Well, that's a very difficult question. To the extent that there wasn't was hardly long enough or enough of it it's very difficult to change the psychology of one group of people when everybody around them is still living in the old way. What actually happened was that block of housing you saw and the others, by the time it was finished in 29, the state of things in the towns with the growth of industry and the 5-year plans and so on was such that it was grossly overpopulated. It was only for a very short time used as was intended. And so you had a situation, this is why it got a bad name, whereby that kind of housing, particularly the double height split section unit, which is better in many ways for the right inhabitants, for 2 people and a child or whatever. By the time you've got 3 families in it, it's far worse than a conventional bourgeois apartment, where one lot can go in the bathroom, the other lot occupies the kitchen, and the others are in the living room. So it never actually had a chance very much to run as it should have done. But I mean, during the first 5-year plan, there was a lot of housing done of a much less architectural sophisticated kind, which applied the same principle in the new worker settlements and so on. And certainly out there, life was collectivized, people did live much less as families and so on, but the architectural solutions were not so elegant as that. So really it's all in too short a time frame, and it's just too small a scale to say that it changed many people's psychology. But the idea is the crucial thing that which is utterly characteristic of that time, that a spatial organization can have that effect. Yeah. Do I see a conflict? A dilemma? Sure. I mean, the first thing is that very charging with an ideology is itself characteristic of its time, of a certain state of society which believed that, if you had an ideology, it was useful and it actually got you to a certain specific other state of society. I don't find a conflict in the sense that they seem to me to be completely, the park is only a little less fees, it contains certain theoretical ideas, it's bigger than many people have managed to build in recent years in terms of extent. So it's a kind of little laboratory work itself, perhaps, for a city or a piece of a city. But I don't find it a dilemma in the sense that it seems to me they are characteristic of their two entirely different philosophies. What seems to me significant and why I put them together is that there are those identifiable areas of discussion which are the same. When the constructivists see that, as I say, distance is now measured by time and all these cliches, as it were, if there's these at least new structural observations, I should say, the answer they came up with has a lot in common with what actually happened. I mean, you have it here, you know, a nodal city, completely dispersed, facilities distributed in a kind of almost random way and used to build up a lifestyle according to the choices of an individual, as you say, highly individualistic. And that was what they saw in that planning scheme as the lifestyle of communism. That there were certain constraints. They believed it was for people who were already convinced communists, and that's where the party said you're ahead of your time. In the old 19th century argument, you have to compress the proletariat before, you know, it's safe to let them out, as it were, to disperse them. Change their psychology so radically that you can trust them to live in a little hut and not be bourgeois, to be kind of corny about it. So I don't find a dilemma. It seems to me that one is almost what the other lot predicted, and is a little metaphor for something which is, I mean, it is only a kind of metaphor. But the other thing that seems to me important is that it's precisely this logical assemblage of forms which enables you, if you understand what the rule is about combination, to make a statement about non